Good day. My name is Peter Sikkema. I'm a retired professor of weed science at the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus, and my research focused on weed management in corn, soybean, dry beans, as well as small grains. In my presentation today, I'd like to address a question in terms of weed management, and that is, why do registered herbicides provide variable weed control? Before I address that question, I do want to share four opening thoughts. First of all, I think that herbicides are incredibly valuable weed management tools, but because they're impacted by plant physiology, weather, and soil characteristics, weed control is variable. Frequently, the reason for less than acceptable weed control with herbicides is outside of everybody's control. However, sometimes it is human error. I will go on to say that I think it's irresponsible for herbicide manufacturers, ag retailers, and agronomists to guarantee perfect weed control or acceptable weed control with herbicides. And finally, also, I think it's unreasonable for farmers to expect perfect or acceptable weed control with herbicides in every field every year. This is an experiment that we did on multiple herbicide-resistant mare's tail control. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that it was done on Walton McLean's farm. And Roundup plus Sharpen plus Merge was applied. And I think that I would be on Walt McLean's Christmas list if he got that level of mare's tail control on his farm. What's really perplexing is Mike Smith farms only 60 miles away from Walt McLean, and the exact same herbicide was used. The herbicide was applied at approximately the same time when the fleabane was approximately 4 inches in diameter. The same research technician applied the herbicide using the same sprayer, the same water carrier volume, same pressure, and same nozzle tips, and you can see the difference in control. And so what I did is I looked at 93 trials that we did on commercial farms in Ontario with Roundup plus Sharpen for the control of glyphosate-resistant mare's tail. And you will note that in 58% of the experiments, the control was between 90 and 100%. In 9% of the experiments, the control was between 80 and 89%. In 9% of the experiments, it was between 70 and 79%. In 8%, it was between 50 and 69%. And in 16% of the experiments, the control was less than 50%. So the exact same herbicide provided 100% control in 5 experiments, and it provided as little as 5% control in another experiment on a commercial farm in Ontario. And that raises the question, why? Why do herbicides provide variable weed control? Variable weed control may be due to extremes in weather. It could be due to variations in soil characteristics. It could be due to weed specifics, the incorrect application timing, application issues, or simply the wrong herbicide was selected for the weed spectrum in a specific field. So in terms of variable weed control due to extremes in weather, it could be due to too little rain after the application of soil-applied herbicides, or it could be too hot and dry before the application of post-emergence herbicides. So looking at too little rain after the application of a soil-applied herbicide, pre-plant and pre-emergence herbicides with soil activity require rainfall to dissolve the herbicide into soil water solution so that it can be taken up by weed seedlings, and this is commonly referred to as herbicide activation. If no rainfall occurs within 7 to 10 days, weed control may be reduced with almost all soil applied herbicides. And many herbicide labels will say if there isn't an activating rain event, shallow cultivation or rotary hoeing may be recommended to remove emerged weeds. This is in my research trials. This is poor green foxtail control with Outlook. And here you can see poor lamb's quarters control with Callisto. I think Outlook is an excellent green foxtail herbicide. It just happens to be that we did not get an activating rain that year where the experiment was conducted. And similarly, I think Callisto's an excellent lamb's quarters herbicide. And once again, there was no activating rain event after a pre-emergence application. And now this research that was conducted by Yamei et al. In 2016, they were looking at green foxtail control residua, and where there was less than 12.5 millimeters of rain or half an inch of rain, or where there was greater, than half an inch of rain, the control was 88%. And notice where the amount of rain was less than a quarter of an inch, there was a 26% decrease in the control of green foxtail residua. In addition, we had too little, too little rain with soil applied herbicides. Rain is required to move the herbicide into the soil to reduce photodegradation and volatilization losses. And you can get reduced weed control under dry conditions with pre-emergence applications of Prowl. And here you can see poor giant foxtail control with Prowl, once again in one of my experiments. And possibly that was due to insufficient rain to move the herbicide into the soil to protect it from photodegradation and volatilization losses. In this research that was conducted by Andrea Smith while she was a graduate student in my program, here she was looking at annual grass control with Prowl and soybean. The two species were large crabgrass and barnyard grass, where there was 4 to 8 tenths of an inch of rain. You can see that the control was 93 and 97%, and it was decreased to 79 and 75%, where there was less than 10 millimeters of rain or less than 4 tenths of an inch of rain. So one of the questions that I frequently get is how much rain is required to activate a soil applied herbicide? And my standard answer is it depends. And I think many people will think that Peter works for the government, he works for the University of Guelph, and he won't give us a straight answer on anything. And I'm standing by my answer that it depends. And I think the number one thing that influences the amount of rain you need to activate a soil applied herbicide is the soil moisture conditions prior to herbicide application. If that soil is close to field capacity, you may only need a quarter inch of rain to activate that herbicide. In contrast to that, if that soil was powder dry the day you put on your soil applied herbicide, you may get an inch of rain, and that may still not be enough to activate that herbicide. The amount of rain required is influenced by both soil texture and organic matter content. You need more rain on a fine textured soil that's high in organic matter. It's influenced by the herbicide group and active ingredient within that group. In my research, I think that the group 15 herbicides are the first group to fail in growing seasons with low rainfall. And the next thing is it's going to be determined by the herbicide rate applied. You can weatherproof a herbicide to a degree by using the highest labeled rate on the label. And finally, it is influenced by the weed species, and the most difficult to control weed species on the label will be the first to escape in a dry year. So now I'll go on to two hot and dry conditions with post-emergence herbicides. So during periods of drought, it's more difficult for post-herbicides to cross the cuticle and enter the living portion of the plant. The cuticle is thicker and more continuous. In addition, low relative humidity under hot, dry conditions reduces cuticle wetting, and it increases the speed of drying of spray droplets on the leaf, and the above result in reduced herbicide absorption. And there's reduced weed control with almost all post-emergence herbicides under hot, dry conditions. This is some research by Waldecker and Weiss at University of Minnesota. And here they were looking at the absorption of glyphosate under adequate moisture and drought conditions. And you can see that there was a 15% decrease in the amount of glyphosate absorbed under drought conditions. In the same experiment, they looked at glyphosate translocation. And under adequate moisture, 20% of the absorbed glyphosate was translocated, and that was reduced to 7% under drought conditions, or there was a 13 percentage point decrease in the amount of glyphosate that was translocated under drought conditions. And in this research conducted by Cal Messersmith at North Dakota State University, he was looking at velvet leaf control and its influence and the influence of uh, weather with glyphosate. And once again, you'll notice that under adequate moisture, glyphosate provided 95% control of velvet leaf, and that decreased to 60% under drought conditions. Weed control with herbicides is influenced by variations in soil characteristics. There's reduced control on fine textured soils that are high in organic matter, and it's also influenced by soil pH as well as soil tilth. So most soil applied herbicides are adsorbed to clay or an organic matter, and the herbicide rate should be adjusted depending on soil type and organic matter content. And you have reduced weed control with herbicides are tightly adsorbed to clay and organic matter. And if you look on the labels in Canada, on the Python label, it says do not apply to soils with greater than 5% organic matter. Spartan and Zidua, it says do not apply to soils with greater than 6% organic matter, and Treflan to soils with greater than 10% organic matter. This is some research that was provided to me from FMC, and they were looking at the effect of soil texture on the activity of Spartan or authority. And velvet leaf control on a coarse textured soil was 87%, and that decreased by 7% on a medium textured soil. And on a fine textured soil, the control was reduced 29%. So there's poor weed control on fine textured soils. And the reason is a greater amount of the herbicide is adsorbed to the soil and not available for weed control. In terms of soil pH, for some soil applied herbicides, soil pH affects the ionization properties of the herbicides, and some herbicides protonate or deprotonate depending on soil pH. Those may be new terms for some of you. Just think the herbicide either accepts or releases a hydrogen atom depending on soil pH, and the charge on the herbicide is changed from negative to a positive charge depending on whether or not it accepted that hydrogen atom. So, at low soil pH, Sencor or metribuzin forms cations in the soil which are more tightly adsorbed to the negatively charged clay and organic matter, resulting in reduced weed control. So at higher soil pH, you have better weed control. And notice you have a double bonded oxygen at the #1 position on the metribuzin molecule. However, at lower pH, the molecule accepts a hydrogen atom, it becomes positively charged, and at lower pH, because it's positively charged, it's bound to the soil colloid, it is biologically unavailable for weed control, and that's why soil pH affects the activity of many soil-applied herbicides. The best data that I found in terms of the effect of soil pH on weed control was a study that was conducted by Brian Jenks and George Kagodi at North Dakota State University. They were looking at biennial wormwood control with Python, where the pH was 78%. Python provided 100% control of biennial wormwood. Where the pH was 6.5, the control was 85%, where there was a 15% decrease in control. And where the pH was 5.4, the control was 45%, where there was a 55% decrease in control due to changes in soil pH. In terms of soil tilth, large clods may result in reduced weed control with soil-applied herbicides. Soil lumps in the soil prevent even distribution of the herbicide. Weed seeds can germinate and emerge from below the clods. And if there are too many clods, the field should be tilled prior to herbicide application to improve uniformity of weed control. And really interesting, many herbicide labels have a statement on the label referring to lumpy soils. And on the bicep label in Canada, it says apply evenly to firm, lump-free seed bed. Weed control with herbicides is influenced by weed characteristics. It could be influenced by cuticle composition and thickness, weed density, time of germination and emergence, and herbicide resistance, whether you have single or multiple resistance. And it's also influenced by the mechanism of resistance. So in terms of differences in the cuticle varies in composition and thickness, and that varies among weeds species and during the growing season. Generally, younger plants have thinner and less developed cuticles, and thinner cuticles are more permeable to herbicide, which results in greater herbicide absorption and improved weed control efficacy with almost all post-emergence herbicides. Here's some research that was summarized, and it includes research conducted by a number of different scientists. I had no idea that lamb's quarters, there's a 28-fold difference in the epicuticular wax on the leaf surface in lamb's quarters compared to velvet leaf. Or you could say there's 14 times more cuticle on lamb's quarters than a green foxtail plant. And the cuticle on the leaf surface is a very effective barrier to the absorption of post-emergence herbicides. The next thing that affects the activity of all herbicides, whether they're soil applied or post-emergence, is weed density. This is some really interesting research that was conducted by Christian Wilms while he was a graduate student in my program. He was looking at water hemp control with bicep, where there were less than 70 water hemp plants per square meter. Bicep provided 98% control of water hemp. Really interesting. In other experiments conducted on commercial farms in Ontario, the density was greater than 700 plants per square meter, and the control was 79%. So if there were two weed escapes at 70 plants per square meter, if you have 10 times as many plants per square meter, you do the math, you would say 2 times 10 is 20, and that's not what happens with herbicides. And there were 147 weed escapes at the higher weed density. I want to stress that this research was conducted on different farms in Ontario. That's why there was the different density. And these results are confounded by rainfall, soil characteristics, and the variable water hemp biotypes on the farms where these experiments were conducted. Regardless, the activity of both soil applied and post-emergence herbicides is impacted by weed density. And I think all farmers know that. If a farmer was considering using a below herbicide label rate, I would ask you the rhetorical question is, would he use that below label rate in the dirtiest field on his farm? And I think all of you would answer no. If you're going to use a reduced herbicide rate, they're going to use it in the cleanest field on their farm. All farmers know that weed density impacts herbicide efficacy. And the herbicide manufacturers are aware of that. In this study conducted by Hoffman and Levy in 1978, they found that in fields with extremely heavy weed pressure, control may not be commercially acceptable. And some of the herbicide manufacturers have statements on the label regarding weed density. On the dual label in Canada, it says use the higher rate for heavier weed problems. On the atrazine label, it says use higher rate for heavy weed infestations. On the Shield-X label, it says use of the higher rate for heavier weed infestations is recommended. And on the Corvus label, it says use higher rates within the labeled rate range for heavier weed pressure. And I would go on to say that I think every herbicide label should have a statement stating reduced weed control efficacy in fields with high weed densities. Now, in terms of weeds, we'll look at time of germination and emergence. Some weed species germinate late in the spring or early summer, or they germinate over an extended period of time. This is some really neat research that was conducted by Mike Shriver while he was a graduate student in my program. And what we asked Mike to do is he went to one farm in Ontario, and we asked him to go there every Monday morning. He would count the number of water hemp that had emerged in permanent quadrats that he had set up on that farm. After he counted the number of water hemp plants that emerged, he would spray it off with Liberty, and he would go back the following Monday morning and do the exact same thing. First of all, notice that this is a logarithmic scale. So in the 7 days prior to June 1, about 400 water hemp plants came up per square meter. Mike burned them off with Liberty, came back the following Monday, and about 300 plants had emerged. In the 7 days prior to June 14, about 500 plants per square meter had emerged. What really interested me, if you look on August 22, in the 7 days prior to August 22, presumably we had a rain event, and there were still 100 water hemp plants where it came up per square meter. The last count that Mike did was on October 25, and in the 7 days prior to that, about 5 plants per square meter still emerge. So water hemp begins emerging after your last cultivation in the spring or your burn down herbicide, and it continues to come up all season long. And that impacts the length of residual activity you need from your soil applied herbicide. So herbicide concentration is reduced due to photochemical and microbial degradation beginning immediately after application. So if you apply a herbicide on Monday for weed control on your farm and it's a soil applied residual herbicide, there is less herbicide on Tuesday and it continues to decrease throughout the growing season. And really, that's a good thing because otherwise there would be way more recropping restrictions with the use of herbicide. However, because this herbicide is being degraded, you have reduced control of late emerging weeds. And I'll give you the example of water hemp or velvet leaf control with the dicamba-based herbicides Ingenia or Extendamax, or eastern black nightshade and fall panicum control with the group 15 herbicides like Dual, Outlook, and Zidua. I got these really neat pictures. They were from Joe Eichly at North Dakota State University. And Joe noticed this water hemp plant that came up approximately on September 1. And really interesting to me, that plant had gone through the vegetative and reproductive stages by September 25, so 3.5 weeks after emergence, and it had produced viable weed seeds within 25 days. So now I'll discuss herbicide resistance, single versus multiple herbicide resistant mare's tail. Early on, when we started conducting research on glyphosate resistant mare's tail control in Ontario, uh, we added Python to glyphosate applied pre-plant in corn, and you'll notice perfect control of the mare's tail. This happens to be Tom Hebblethwaite's farm. He farms near Morpeth, Ontario. Chris Steele farms near Mull, Ontario. And it's only maybe 10 miles from Tom Hebblethwaite's farm to Chris Steele. And I just couldn't understand it. I went to review both of these experiments one morning. I went to Tom Hebblethwaite's farm first, perfect control. I went to Chris Steele's farm. I was expecting to see perfect control. And you'll notice there was no activity at all from Roundup plus Python. And the reason was Tom Hebblethwaite had glyphosate resistant mare's tail or group 9 resistant mare's tail. And unfortunately, Chris Steele had multiple herbicide resistant mare's tail, which was resistant to both the group 2 as well as the group 9 herbicides. The activity of herbicides is influenced by the mechanism of herbicide resistance. This happens to be Doug Nelson's farm in Ontario. Here I'm looking at water hemp control, and you can see there's absolutely no activity from atrazine. And only 100 meters away, we did an experiment in soybean, and there was perfect control with another group 5 herbicide, Sencor. So how does that make sense? You have two group 5 herbicides, one fails and the other gives perfect control. And it's due to the mechanism of herbicide resistance and the chemical structure of those herbicides. The reason why atrazine fails is this water hemp biotype has elevated levels of a glutathione S-transferase enzyme. It binds to the chlorine at the number 1 position on atrazine. That conjugated herbicide is recognized by ABC transporters. It's exported into the vacuole or extracellular space, and you have a resistant water hemp plant on the farm. In contrast to that, on the exact same farm, 100 meters away, you have perfect control with Sencor, another group 5 herbicide. And the reason is it has an oxygen at the number 1 position in contrast to the chlorine. The oxygen does not provide a binding site for this specific glutathione S-transferase. the herbicide remains biologically active and gives perfect control of group 5 resistant water hemp on Doug Nelson's farm. So I thought I understood this quite well. And here, once again, you can see the poor control with atrazine on Doug Nelson's farm. But now the mechanism of resistance is not enhanced metabolism. It is an amino acid substitution. It is a a serine to glycine amino acid substitution at position 264. This is Tony Stratman's farm. He farms about 100 kilometers or 60 miles away from where Doug Nelson farms, and a complete failure on his farm. I just showed you on Doug Nelson's farm, Sencor gives 100% control, and it gives 0% control on Tony Stratman's farm. And the reason is the mechanism of resistance is different, and that impacts which herbicides are still effective. The next reason why you could have variable weed control with herbicides is application timing. It could be too early with pre-plant herbicides, too early with post, too late with soil-applied herbicides, and too late with post-emergence herbicides. In terms of too early with pre-plant herbicides, early pre-plant applications, such as on April 15 and no-till, provide lower control in mid-August to post-emergence applications made on June 15 because the herbicide has been degraded more, and you have reduced late-season weed control in no-till corn and soybean simply because the herbicide has been degraded more. In terms of too early with post-emergence herbicides with essentially no residual activity applied too early before all the weeds have emerged, and you have no control of late emerging weeds with herbicides such as Assure, Post, Select, and Fusilade, Blazer, Bascaran, Maestro, and Reflex, as well as glyphosate and Liberty. And this is in my research trials. This corn, this is Roundup Ready corn. Actually, Roundup had been applied, and there was just a new flush of weeds after the early application of Roundup. In terms of too late with soil-applied herbicides applied after the weeds have emerged, and you have reduced weed control with herbicides such as Dual, Outlook, and Prowl. This is research that was done by Jim Kells while he was at Michigan State University, and where Dual was applied either pre-emergence or at the two-leaf stage of corn. It provided 100 or 99% control of giant foxtail. However, where it was delayed to the four-leaf stage of corn, the control was reduced to 20%. And that's very common with the group 15 herbicides. The control of annual grasses decreases rapidly once those grasses have emerged. And now too late with post-emergence herbicides. Generally, annual weeds are easier to control when they are young and actively growing. Young weeds, generally speaking, the cuticle is thinner and more permeable, and the plant is growing more actively. And you have reduced control of large weeds with almost all post-emergence herbicides, including the group 1 herbicides like Assure, Post, Select, and Fusilade, the post-contact herbicides like Bascaran, Blazer, Maestro, and Reflex, the group 27 herbicides, Armazon, Callisto, and Shieldex, and as well glyphosate and Liberty. This is some really neat research that was conducted by Brendan Metzger while he was a graduate student in my program. He was looking at ladies' thumb control with Shieldex plus atrazine. It was applied when the weeds were 4, 8, and 12 inches in height. Where lady's thumb was 4 inches in height at the time of application, the control was 93%. That decreased by 19% when the weeds were up to 8 inches in height to 72%, and control was only 50% where the weeds were 12 inches in height, and there was a 43% decrease in control compared to when they were 4 inches in height. And I think this is similar with almost every post herbicide. It's to varying degrees with each active ingredient and each weed species. And the herbicide manufacturers are aware of that. Here you can see poor lamb's quarters control with reflex applied post-emergence. And the herbicide label in Canada says apply reflex liquid herbicide when weeds are small and actively growing. Later applications may result in poor weed control due to advanced weed growth, and that is common with almost every post-emergence herbicide. So weed control is influenced by herbicide or by application issues. There could be antagonism, herbicide rate, failure to add the correct tank mix partner, adjuvant selection, as well as time of day. Numerous tank mixes with some herbicides or foliar fertilizers will result in reduced weed control. Basagran antagonizes annual grass control with post and select. Classic and first rate antagonized yellow foxtail control with Assure. Clay-based herbicide formulations antagonize the activity of glyphosate, and some foliar fertilizers will antagonize glyphosate as well. This is some really interesting research that was conducted by Clarence Swanton at the University of Guelph. Here he was looking at barnyard grass control with Assure. When Assure was tank mixed with Harmony, the control was 94%. There was no antagonism. However, another sulfonylurea classic, and you can see the control was reduced to 78%, so there was a 16% decrease in control, or you can say that it antagonized the control by 16%. And first rate, another group 2 herbicide, but in a different herbicide family, reduced the control to 48%, so there was a 46% decrease in control due to herbicide antagonism. This is a picture that I took of the work that Clarence Swanton had done at the University of Guelph. This is a 3-way tank mix of Classic plus Harmony plus Assure. Look how poor the annual grass control is. Here he had the exact same 3 herbicides, Classic and Harmony, but it's not applied as a tank mix. He separated them in time by 1 week, and he applied the Assure 1 week after the broadleaf herbicides, and notice the dramatic improvement in control where he split applied the herbicides. Now, this is a research trial that we did in my program at the Huron Research Station. One of the foliar fertilizer companies asked us to evaluate their foliar fertilizer combined with glyphosate. The foliar fertilizer companies like to do that. They'll say, when you're putting on your post-emergence herbicide, add our foliar fertilizer, and you don't have any increase in application cost by combining it with your post-emergence herbicide. In this experiment, glyphosate by itself provided 76% control of lamb's quarters, 93% control of green smartweed, 100% control of green smartweed, and 86% control of common ragweed. Really interesting, there was a 6% decrease in control with the addition of the foliar fertilizer for green smartweed. There was a 13% decrease in the control of wild mustard with the addition of the foliar fertilizer. There was a 33% decrease in the control of common ragweed, and a 58% decrease in the control of lamb's quarters. We took that particular experiment to yield. Glyphosate by itself, due to excellent weed control, corn yield was 171 bushels per acre. And the addition of the foliar fertilizer, due to reduced weed control, the corn yield was 123 bushels per acre. And you can see there was a 48 bushel per acre decrease in corn yield due to antagonized weed control from the addition of the foliar fertilizer. You need to adjust the herbicide rate depending on soil characteristics, and many herbicide labels will say use a higher rate on fine textured soils with high organic matter. You need to increase the herbicide rate if applied very early pre-plant or with some fall application of herbicides. And you need to increase the rate for difficult to control weed species. You would need to use a higher rate of balance for the control of proso millet, high rate of atrazine and Sencor for control of ragweed and velvet leaf, and you need to increase the rate of glyphosate depending on the weed species as well as the weed height. This is some research that I did with a colleague of mine in southwestern Ontario, Dr. Rob Nurse at the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Research Station at Harrow. What Rob and I were trying to determine is how much glyphosate do you need for the control of various weed species. Please take note that the weeds were tall when we applied the herbicide. We did that on purpose because we wanted to differentiate the amount of glyphosate you need based on weed species. And in the research that Rob and I did, we found that you need 5 times as much glyphosate to control a 12-inch ragweed as a green foxtail plant. So make sure you understand what's on the y-axis here. This is the amount of Roundup you require for 90% control. And this is in liters per acre. For those of you in the US, think of it as in quarts per acre. The general use rate in Ontario is 0.67 liters per acre. And here you can see the typical use rate. And at that use rate, you would get acceptable control of foxtail barnyard grass, as well as redroot pigweed. You need twice as much glyphosate to kill a lamb's quarters compared to a barnyard grass or green or redroot pigweed. And you need 5 times as much glyphosate to control common ragweed as green foxtail. So every herbicide has weeds that it's really good on and weeds that it struggles on. You need to know the activity of each herbicide on those weed species and adjust your herbicide rate depending on the weed spectrum in each individual field on your farm. Not only do you need to adjust the rate of the herbicide depending on the weed species on your farm, you also have to adjust the rate depending on the size of the weeds. Once again, this is research that I did with Rob Nurse. And here we're looking at the impact of weed height on how much glyphosate you need to get 90% control. This is the control of lamb's quarters. So in the work that we did, you need 0.46 liters of glyphosate per acre. So you think of quarts per acre. But for the control of a 4-inch lamb's quarters, you need 0.67 liters per acre to control an 8-inch lamb's quarters, and you need 1.28 liters per acre to control a 12-inch lamb's quarters. So our data says that you need to increase the rate of Roundup 3-fold to get 90% control of a 12-inch lamb's quarters compared to a 4-inch lamb's quarters. Now, in terms of the impact of application is failure to add the correct tank mix partner, and the interaction between herbicide modes of action. I think it's quite well understood that there's a synergistic increase in control when you combine a group 5 herbicide with a group 27 herbicide. So in this research that was conducted by John Fluttert while he was a graduate student in my program, Shield X by itself provided 34% of glyphosate-resistant mare's tail. Atrazine by itself provided 79% control, and the combination provided 94% control of glyphosate-resistant mare's tail in Ontario. This is some pictures from the research that John did. Here's the weedy control. Atrazine by itself did not provide commercially acceptable control. Shield X by itself did not provide commercially acceptable control. Really interesting. You combine these two herbicides that don't provide acceptable control, and you get near perfect control because of the synergistic activity between a group 27 and a group 5 herbicide. And you can get that increase in control with other reactive oxygen species generating herbicides. And here, once again, you can see near perfect control with the tank mix of Shield X plus Maestro in corn. In John's research, he looked at a number of different reactive oxygen species generating herbicides. Really interesting. Here you can see weed control with Callisto, which is the gray bar graph. It was 51% control of common ragweed, 5% control of green foxtail. Liberty by itself provided 68 and 78% control. And in the research conducted by John, the combination of Callisto and Liberty, the tank mix provided 92% control of common ragweed and 83% control of green foxtail. In John's research, the best herbicide to combine with Callisto for the control of a wide range of weed species was Liberty. It wasn't either atrazine or Maestro, and it's because of the improved activity of Liberty on the annual grasses. There was the best broad spectrum control of Callisto plus Liberty. In terms of adjuvant selection, the activity of many post herbicides is reduced dramatically when applied with the wrong adjuvant. So this is research that John once again did looking at weed control with Shield X plus atrazine. Where Shield X was applied without an adjuvant, it provided 29, 49, and 50% control of ragweed, velvet leaf, and lamb's quarters. Where he added Agro 90, the control was 75, 64, and 95%. And in John's research, the best adjuvant to add to Shield X plus atrazine was Merge, and it provided 97, 91, and 98% control of common ragweed, velvet leaf, and lamb's quarters. So there was a 68% improvement in the control of common ragweed with the addition of Merge, a 42% improvement in velvet leaf control, and a 48% improvement in the control of lamb's quarters with the addition of Merge to Shield X plus atrazine. Here's some pictures from John's research. Here's the weedy control, Shield X plus atrazine with no adjuvant. And notice the dramatic improvement in weed control by the addition of Merge. And it's just really impressive the impact that adding the correct adjuvant can have when you add it to a post-emergence herbicide. In terms of time of day, it's been documented to affect the activity of some post-emergence herbicides on some weed species. And research indicates that weed control with many post-emergence herbicides is reduced when applied very early in the morning or very late at night. So this is looking at the effect of time of day on weed control with Liberty. Liberty was applied at 6 in the morning, 9 in the morning, 12 noon, 3 p.m., 6 p.m., 9 p.m., and midnight. And you will notice the average control of velvet leaf ragweed, lamb's quarters, barnyard grass, and green foxtail is presented on this graph. And there was a 32% control, average, a 32% average decrease in control of those 5 weed species when you compare the control at 3 o'clock in the afternoon with 12 midnight. So this is just some pictures of that research. Here's the weedy control. You cannot even see the ground between the corn rows. That's how heavy the weed density is. What I'd really like you to notice is notice the near perfect control. At when Liberty was applied at 12 noon, at 3 p.m., as well as at 6 p.m. And once again, you can hardly see the ground between the corn rows when Liberty was applied at 6 in the morning or at 12 midnight. So there is a huge time of day effect with a herbicide like a Liberty. It's always encouraging when other weed scientists corroborate the research results that you get. And I got this from an extension bulletin from Alan York at North Carolina State University. And I just cut and paste this out of that extension bulletin. And this was the caption that Alan wrote: "Weed control with Liberty, the brighter, the better." And he said, don't apply it at 6 a.m., don't apply it at 9 p.m., and apply it at 2 p.m. And similar to our results, notice the dramatic time of day effect with a herbicide like Liberty. In the research that we did, corn yield was influenced by time of day. And if you compare the yield when Liberty was applied at 12 midnight compared to 12 noon, there was a 48 bushel per acre difference in corn yield just because you delayed the application by 12 hours. Just a huge time of day effect on weed control and subsequent corn yield. So I think you should adjust herbicide application timing during the day based on the herbicide. Apply post-emergence contact herbicides during the warmest sunlit hours of the day. And the activity of post-systemic herbicides is not affected to the same degree by time of day of application. We've done this research with 13 active ingredients. Every single active ingredient has a time of day effect. It's just that it's more pronounced with some herbicides than others. Generally speaking, the effect of time of day with systemic herbicides, let's say like dicamba, 2,4-D glyphosate, is not very pronounced. In contrast to that, with contact herbicides like Liberty, Basgran, Blazer, Reflex, Maestro, they have a big time of day effect. And generally speaking, I would say that the contact herbicide should be applied during the warmest sunlit hours of the day. Finally, to wrap up, is herbicide choice. Each herbicide has its strengths and weaknesses, and weed management practitioners must match the herbicide selected to the weed spectrum in each individual field. Here you can see velvet leaf escapes with Sencor, common ragweed escapes with Sencor. I'm not surprised. Sencor is not that good on velvet leaf as well as common ragweed, and you should adjust your herbicide choice in soybean if those are two weeds in a specific field. Here you can see poor lamb's quarters control with first rate applied post-emergence. You would get much better control of lamb's quarters with Harmony applied post-emergence than first rate. And here's Eastern Black Nightshade escapes with Harmony applied post-emergence. And once again, you should adjust your herbicide accordingly. To wrap up, I do have four summary thoughts. The fact is, weed control with herbicides is variable. That is just a fact. And I think it's irresponsible for herbicide manufacturers, ag retailers, and agronomists to guarantee perfect or acceptable weed control with herbicides. Also, I think it's unrealistic or unreasonable for farmers to expect perfect or acceptable weed control with herbicides in every field every year. Even though weed management with herbicides is variable, they are incredible weed management tools, and the return on investment in herbicides is tremendous.